Hello and welcome. This is the first video of a new playlist called Jackie Answers. You asked me a question and I'm going to answer. In today's video, I'm going to answer the question, Jackie, how did you learn Portuguese? I'd like to start with some background information. So before I started studying Portuguese, I had an advanced level of Spanish, which was a really big advantage because Portuguese and Spanish are both Latin languages, so there were a lot of similarities. So that was definitely an advantage. However, I took my first Portuguese class when I was 28 years old, which is a little bit old, I think. And I had no exposure to Portuguese before this class. Or maybe I had, but I would never have recognized someone speaking Portuguese on the street. I knew nothing, not even oi, ciao, nothing, okay? So that again was a big disadvantage. Why I decided to learn Portuguese. So I decided to start taking Portuguese classes to prepare myself for a trip to Brazil for Carnival. So some friends of mine and we took a beginner group class at a school called Brazil in Chicago, and our teacher was Marcelo Jarmangia. Thank you, Marcelo. You are wonderful, so great. And it was a lot of fun. And for those of you who are starting out a new language, I highly recommend finding a teacher, especially if you are a complete beginner, to guide you, to really teach you the basics, the phonetics, the grammar, the structure. And find a teacher that speaks your language as well. I could not imagine taking classes with someone who didn't speak English when I was first starting out. So that's my recommendation. Traveling to Brazil. So when I first came to Brazil, it was for Carnival in 2009. This was the first time I finally got to practice my Portuguese. And it was really exciting. I knew very little still at the time, but I felt really motivated because I was hearing it a lot. I was learning a lot about the culture. I was learning more about the music, and just being immersed in the Brazilian culture really just made me fall even more in love with the language, which I also think is so important when we're studying something. We end up spending so much time on it, and if it's not something that we at least like, it becomes a really kind of negative process. So I really recommend that you also learn about the culture, really fall in love with the country, the people, the language, and get out and practice. Even as a beginner, it's fun to try practicing with other people and test out what you know. And actually, after this trip, I was even more determined to spend more time in Brazil. So I decided to take more classes. I left the group classes and I took private classes and semi-private classes. Semi-private classes are classes with one other person, aula em dupla. And I really just focused a lot more, and I spent a lot more time studying on my own. What I did to learn Portuguese, the steps that I took to actually learn the language. So the first step that I took was I took classes. I signed up for classes, so I had a teacher that was correcting me and guiding me and giving me homework and giving me explanations. The other thing that I did was I listened to a lot of Portuguese. I listened to a lot of music. At the time, there were not so many podcasts and audios available, because this was in 2009. This was before, I don't even think I had a smartphone at the time. It was a little MP3 player. But I listened to a podcast called Tá Falado, which explained the differences between Portuguese, Spanish, and English. And I would listen to it every day on my way to work. I had about a 40-minute walk to work every single day. I worked at a high school in Chicago, and my students would drive past and say, Miss Katzis, do you want to ride? And I was like, no, this is great. I'm listening to my audios, I'm listening to my music, and it was really kind of like my downtime. It was very therapeutic in some ways. I felt like I was just transplanted and taken to a faraway land many times in the cold, snowy winters of Chicago. contact with the language, listening to the language, watching TV, reading books, listening to music. I know music is not the best thing because we don't always sing with grammatical accuracy and stuff like that, but it's something fun, something light, and it's still a great way just to train your ear and increase your knowledge. So besides taking classes and listening to a lot of Portuguese audios and music, I think the one thing that actually helped me more than anything was my little notebook. I had a little notebook that I carried around with me, and any new expression that I learned or anything that I wanted to know how to say. So in English, if, for example, I wanted to go to the bank and ask for change, and if I say, oh, how would I say this in Portuguese? I would write it down, and I would ask my teacher, or I would look it up. And this notebook became my personalized dictionary of words and phrases that I had learned and that I was learning. And any spare minute that I had, if I was waiting for the bus, if I was, at home or just in between classes, I would quickly review the notes that I had taken. And this reviewing over and over and over again is essential because otherwise we simply don't remember all the information that we learn. Moving to Brazil. So I moved to Brazil in late September 2009. When I moved to Brazil, I still had a pretty, I'll say intermediate, but lower intermediate level of Portuguese. My teacher even told me, he said I was speaking like 90% Spanish and 10% Portuguese at the time. So really the only person that was a constant Portuguese teacher to me was my husband, who I met 2 weeks after I landed in Brazil. So I always tell people, if you're studying a language, it's always helpful to find a significant other or a friend or even a teacher, just someone that you can practice with, okay? The other thing I would do is create an immersion experience wherever you are. You do not need to live in another country to learn another language. Some of my strongest students have never left Brazil. So that is something that a lot of people think they need to do, but it's not the case. And if you go to the US or Canada or England, you'll find a lot of people there that do not speak English. So if I were you, I would just really put yourself in contact with the language as much as possible. Because this balance of what you learn from a class or a textbook, which is the more formal language, plus the more informal language, or we call this input, your contact with the language, it will really give you a more well-rounded experience. Because when you are listening to things like to native speakers speaking, you're going to learn what we call the fillers. So for example, in English we say like, well, yeah. These little fillers you're not really going to learn in a textbook. And if you do, you're not necessarily going to know how to use them. And these fillers are things that really make you sound like you have a higher level. And you also learn things like the intonation. In Portuguese, you guys speak a lot more, you're a lot more excited with your language. And in English, we're a little bit more monotone. We don't use as much intonation as you do in Portuguese. And these are all little things that you only pick up really by listening and watching and having contact and exposure to the language. Once you start practicing the language, it takes it to a whole nother level, and it's a lot more fun. So definitely look for people to practice the language with. Follow these steps. I really think they will help you if you're learning Portuguese, English, or any other language. And I hope you guys enjoyed this first episode of Jackie Answers. If you have other questions that you would like me to answer, please let me know in the comments below. And before you go, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my page, follow me on Facebook and Instagram, and remember, if you have any questions, ask Jackie. Bye-bye!